Okay, thank you very much for joining us this evening in Israel for our webinar address by Reserve Colonel Pnina Sharvit Baruch, who will analyze for us today the laws of war, specifically as they apply to Israel in its current war on Hamas. I just want to say that if you have any questions, you can either ask them using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and then we will ask them on your behalf at the end of Pnina's address, or you can raise your digital hand using that icon at the end of the address, and if chosen, we'll activate your microphone and you'll be able to ask the questions live. As we wrote in the flyer for this event, Israel stands today accused by large parts of the global public media and public opinion and parts of the United Nations and even public officials with the United Nations that we're carrying out war crimes and even crimes against humanity in the war in Gaza. One of the aims of this webinar is to try to examine whether these claims have any basis in law or in fact. Now, the performance of this analysis is not for a moment to minimize the devastation and the loss of life in Gaza right now. In fact, while there's very broad consensus in Israel at least, for the war on Hamas, there is no domestic pressure on the IDF to punish the Palestinian people as a whole, and there's certainly no rejoicing in the streets of Israel at the tragic deaths of what are undoubtedly very large, huge numbers of Palestinians, Palestinian civilians being killed as a result of the actions of the IDF. But if intentions are any indicator at all, then I think it's very clear that Israel's war on Hamas is not a war against the Palestinian people, and its prosecution of that war does not involve any policy of indiscriminate attacks on Palestinian civilians. Before I turn to Colonel Sharvit Baruch, I have one request of today's participants, whom I can see come from a number of countries, and I'm hoping that come with a selection of opinions and beliefs. I'd ask for the purpose of this webinar that you put your preconceptions to the side, whether you think that Israel is primarily responsible for the state of Israeli-Palestinian relations, or whether Israel is a Western European colonial implant in the Middle East. I'll ask you to put that aside for the course at least of this webinar, and just look at the facts as they are today, which is that Israel, which is a country of 9.5 million people, Muslims, Christians, Jews, foreign workers from many different countries, refugees, it's prosecuting a war against a radical Islamist organization whose entire goal is the destruction of all of the state of Israel and the Jews within it. And that if Israel does not defeat that Hamas, then it will, as it again openly admits, will keep on working to commit acts like those that it committed on October the 7th, again and again and again, until Israel and the Jewish people are destroyed. That is the war that is being fought by this state of 9.5 million inhabitants today. And Colonel Sharvit Baruch will seek to examine what are the legal limitations and restrictions on the IDF in prosecuting that war. Reserve Colonel Pnina Sharvit Baruch, welcome. She is currently a senior researcher at the INSS, which is the very prestigious Institute for National Security Studies in Israel. She was formerly an officer in the International Law Department of the Military Advocate General's unit, where she served for about 25 years, 6 of which as its head. She worked intensely on the Oslo Accords, being a legal advisor within Israeli delegations from the early stages of that process all the way through. And in 2000, she participated in the talks and the negotiations with Syria, which obviously ultimately fell through. Colonel Sharvit Baruch also has direct hands-on experience advising operational commanders during military campaigns, and will be able to provide us, I think, with an insight into how real-time decisions are processed and made where potential targets involve or are believed to involve or contain or be in proximity to civilians. So she'll be able to give us a real insight in how that process works. So thank you, Pnina, very much for joining us this evening. The floor is yours.
So thank you very much, Adrian, for inviting me, and thank you for everybody who's come to listen. I will try to talk for only half an hour and let time for questions. And I think, well, firstly, I think it's important to understand that we are here in Israel facing a crisis that we haven't faced since, I think, the creation of the State of Israel, since the War of Independence. That's 75 years ago. Even the Yom Kippur War, which was a huge shock in 1973, wasn't as bad as we are seeing now. The shock, the horror of what happened here, and the level of threats that we are facing. This is not close to any of the operations and armed conflict situations that we have engaged in past years. We've had several rounds of fighting with the Hamas in Gaza, there was Hezbollah in Lebanon, and this is different. So I think it's important to understand this as a kind of context, putting everything into context. Just how did we get to where we are? Before 7th of October, which is a month ago, Israel was actually, we have been facing many rounds of conflict with the Hamas in the Gaza Strip ever since the Hamas took control of the Gaza Strip in 2007, or maybe I should start in 2005, or maybe I should start in 1994. In 1994, we signed, I was, as it was mentioned, the legal advisor in the Oslo Accords, and the first agreement was the Gaza-Jericho Agreement, which created the Palestinian Authority in the Gaza Strip and in part of the West Bank. Then we had the interim agreement of 95, it's known as the Oslo Agreement, where we transferred also more parts of the West Bank to the Palestinian Authority's control, and Israel, in essence, in the Gaza Strip, remained only in some military bases, and there were a few settlements there, but the rest of the Gaza Strip was controlled by the Palestinian Authority, which was in charge of both civilian and internal security issues and public order. In 2005, there was a decision to disengage from the Gaza Strip, to dismantle all the settlements there, evacuate the settlements, 3,000 settlers, and to leave also, evacuate all the military bases in order to end the control, the effective control and the occupation of the Gaza Strip. The idea was that it will be transferred, it was transferred to the Palestinian Authority, and the idea was the Palestinian Authority will create their independent, viable entity, and this could also be later on a model that could be applied in other areas in the West Bank, and finally to achieve eventually a separation, two entities, two states in the longer run. I was, for example, also involved in the disengagement. So one of the things, for example, was to make sure that we transferred the hot houses that were in the settlement area in working conditions, with someone who gave money so they can continue to operate them. What happened, unfortunately, was that in 2006 there were elections in the Palestinian for the Palestinian Council, and the Hamas won the elections. The Palestinian Authority was not ready to transfer the power to the Hamas, but in 2007 the Hamas took control of the Gaza Strip forcefully, threw out, literally threw Fatah people from the rooftops, and took control of the Gaza Strip. And since then, instead of investing in the development of the Gaza Strip, and there was a lot of money coming in, they invested everything in building their military capabilities, rockets and the other military capabilities, and started immediately with rounds of fighting against Israel, which were mainly firing rockets and attempts of infiltration. And then we started a few rounds since then of operations to counter this threat. They also invested a lot in tunnels. The idea was in the beginning tunnels that were trying to get to Israel. So the idea was that through the tunnels they will enter into Israeli villages. This was stopped by Israel, this threat, but they didn't give up on this tunnel idea. And what they did, in fact, was created, and there's an interesting, there are a few articles in the foreign press, an underground town of tunnels linking most parts of the strip. And there they have all their military operation is conducted from there. The headquarters is under the main hospital in Gaza. And they have in these tunnels all the command and control centers and weapons. And so we knew that they had that. We didn't know how sophisticated it was, but this was a threat that we knew. What we didn't, now Israel was, as I said, it was all these rounds of fighting. But the idea was that Israel did not want to enter into a full-fledged war with Hamas. That Israel has no, even the ideological right in Israel has no interest in going back to the Gaza Strip. So there's no reason for Israel to be there. And actually the policy or the idea was that the better the life in the Gaza Strip, the stability will be better. So in recent years and months, the Hamas, which is the de facto government in the Gaza Strip, was enjoying a lot of money to enter there, and a lot of projects and the supply of goods and opening up the borders a little bit for workers coming from Gaza. And the idea was that this way, the Hamas, for pragmatic reasons, will become less violent. This was the conception. It was a misconception, because actually what was happening with all this money that was going in for the construction of the Gaza Strip actually went to the development of the military capabilities. It's also important to understand that the Gaza Strip has an open border to Egypt. So a lot of above land and underground, again, with tunnels. So what we didn't know is a lot of equipment and weapons was entering through there. Everything, even water pipes that were put to supply water to Gaza were taken out and used to create rockets. So everything, everything was devoted to develop this war machine. And on the 7th of October, this war machine was unleashed against Israel with thousands of terrorists storming into Israel, surprising us, eliminating our technological capabilities, and they stormed into military bases and then into villages and also into an open air party. And they didn't just kill and kidnap soldiers and civilians. They actually went into, what they did was a terror, an organized, atrocious terror attack, which really they went into houses of people and they tortured them. They took families, they tied up the children, they tied up the parents, they tortured the children in front of the parents, they tortured the parents in front of the children. They mass raped young girls. They chopped up fingers. They chopped down heads. They burned people alive. This was like a rampage of the worst crimes you can imagine, and I don't want to become, I was a little graphic. It's much more graphic than that. I've seen the footage, I've heard the testimonies. It's the level of cruelty is you can't really, it's difficult to even understand it. It's you can't really sleep after. Every time I try not to see anything anymore because I couldn't sleep for nights. So this was the level of cruelty, and again, in this party with all these young people, again, murdered, butchered, some raped also before being murdered, and 270 Israelis, or not only Israelis, including also foreigners, were kidnapped. And this includes a 9-month-old baby, a 3-year-old little girl whose both parents were murdered, mothers, fathers, children, youngsters, elderly people, their helpers of the elderly people, Thai workers in the agriculture. They were all taken there. Since then, we have heard nothing except just one propaganda kind of clip, which is also so taking hostages is another element. So what we had here is, of course, the worst war crimes, crimes against humanity. It even enters into the definition of genocide because it was done with an intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. That's the definition of genocide. So that even enters into that. Israel was, of course, in shock. We are still in shock. And then they continued, of course, firing rockets. So now Israel understood that the Hamas poses a threat. And also they also destroyed the villages. And we have today 120,000 Israelis, internally displaced Israelis that can't live there. All this area is empty. They're all living in hotels or in houses of people. And we have another front in the north I'll come to. So we have another people from the north also in the center of Israel, 200,000 internally displaced Israelis at the moment. So what happened since then? So what we understood, first of all, that the Hamas is a much bigger threat than we thought. It has both capabilities and, of course, the intentions. And the intentions are to destroy the state of Israel, to shake up the state of Israel. They identified that Israel is in a weak spot, maybe because there were a lot of demonstrations against the government, and they came to the kill. And what also they expected was, and there is this link to the Iran and Hezbollah and other Shiite proxies. So there's this axis of this evil axis around us, that are all also determined on the destruction of the state of Israel. And the idea was that they will also be assisted and they will also enter into the conflict. So in the meantime, we have had already missiles fired at Israel from Yemen, from the Houthis in Yemen, proxies of Iran, some activity against the US from Shia militias in Iraq and in Syria, and the Hezbollah that is also carrying out attacks against Israel north, sometimes carried out by Palestinians in Lebanon, but in general, so we have. So what we see here is that we have a threat from all the fronts. And what we also understand is that if Israel, and they're all looking to see what will happen with Israel in the Gaza Strip, if Israel is perceived as weak and is not able to confront this threat of the Hamas, so we both have the threat of the Hamas remain there, but also the other enemies will also might decide that this is a good time to attack us from all the other fronts. That's why I'm saying that the feeling here in the threat, and it's not just a feeling, it's an analytical, realistic analysis of the situation, is that it could potentially be an existential threat, and in any way a threat that would, and is going to impact Israel. Israel is not going to be the same as it was before the 7th of October. From all its economy, in general, the situation here, the feeling of security. So this is the background to Israel's operations now in the Gaza Strip. And the aim of these operations is to dismantle the capabilities, the military capabilities of Hamas, to dismantle its ability to continue to pose a threat to Israel, and also to make it clear that Israel is strong and also deter our other enemies from entering into the fight. Now, when Israel is operating against the military infrastructure, against this military infrastructure of the Hamas in the Gaza Strip, we have to understand what is the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip is a very narrow, very densely populated area with almost 2 million people living there. And as I said before, the Hamas places all its military infrastructure. It's not only the Hamas, you have also the Islamic Jihad, which is operating together with the Hamas. And they are placing all their military capabilities within civilian buildings, underneath civilian buildings. So that means that the only way to eliminate this threat, to target this military capability is by attacking actually what looks like civilian buildings. But in essence, legally, these are lawful military objectives, because here we have to understand a point is Israel, it's important for Israel to abide by international law, although of course the Hamas did everything, didn't abide by any law, of course carried out the worst war crimes and crimes against humanity, but still there's no reciprocity in the laws of armed conflict. That doesn't mean that we don't have to abide by them, and we are a democratic country, a law-abiding country. It's part of our moral system, our legal system. The protests that we were having against the government was also for this, for retaining our values. So this is also very important for citizens in Israel. And we also have a coalition, and we are very, very thankful to the US for giving us its backing, and it's very important for us to be part of this camp of these liberal countries, this Western countries opposing this axis of evil of Iran that is also supported by North Korea and by Russia. So we want to abide by the laws of armed conflict. According to the laws of armed conflict, if a civilian object is used for military purposes, so it becomes a lawful military objective. That's the definition of a military objective that is in customary international law. It's written in the additional protocol 1, the 1977 additional protocol 1 to the Geneva Convention. This is not something that is disputed, which means that it is lawful to target these buildings, these civilian buildings, because they are lawful military objectives because of their use by the Hamas. This is not the end of the story, because even when you are attacking a lawful military objective, you still have an obligation, first of all, to try to take feasible precautions to minimize harm to civilians. The whole point of the laws of armed conflict or international humanitarian law is to spare civilians as much as possible. So, so there's an idea of issuing warnings when possible, using the most accurate weapons as possible, try to spare the civilians. And also because all this military infrastructure is inside civilian areas, so Israel gave notifications to civilians to leave the northern area where it's focused its attacks, and to move to the southern part of the Gaza Strip. This is an idea also of to minimize the idea to have less civilians there, to minimize the harm. But still civilians stay there. They stay there. Some of them maybe don't want to leave or can't leave, and some of them that did try to leave, the Hamas is also trying to prevent the civilians from leaving, firing even at civilians trying to leave these areas. So it makes it difficult for people to leave, and civilians are still there. And this brings us to the second principle, because the first one that I said was the principle of distinction. You're allowed to target military objectives and not civilians, but civilian objects become military objectives if they're used by the other side for military purposes. But even when you're attacking these targets, you have to abide by the principle of proportionality. Principle of proportionality means that it is lawful to attack a military objective, even if it might cause harm to civilians, expected harm to civilians. It doesn't, the fact that the civilian might be harmed doesn't make it an unlawful attack. But if the harm, or it's called the collateral harm to civilians expected from the attack of a certain target, would be considered excessive in relation to the military advantage, then the attack would not be considered proportionate. That means that with regard to the targets that are being attacked, let's say by the Air Force, you have to make a balancing act and examine what is the military advantage anticipated from the attack, what is the anticipated harm to civilians, and examine and see if that harm is excessive or not. Now, we do have legal advisors, and I was in charge of the operational legal advisors, and they are there from the division level, command level, general chief of staff level, and they do advise also about targeting, but eventually proportionality, we must remember, according to the law, again, the standard is the reasonable military commander. Eventually, it's a decision of the commander that has to do this very, very difficult balancing act. What we can understand is, of course, that the higher the stakes, the higher the threat from that a certain target is that a certain target poses, so the military advantage is higher, and that could make even higher level of anticipated harm to civilians still not be considered excessive. the law gives also the more weight to the military advantage, because only if the collateral damage to civilians is excessive would it be unlawful. So this is the principle of proportionality. Israel is applying this principle. It still means, so first of all, it means that the fact that civilians might get killed doesn't mean that the action itself was unlawful. Now, what we have to also understand is that it is very difficult and almost impossible to get to the military infrastructure without also harming civilians. This is the unfortunate reality of this tactic that the Hamas is using. And here, I just maybe, with another point, but I just want to emphasize this point, because what the Hamas does, it uses the civilians. First of all, the Hamas knew that Israel would, after what it did in Israel, that was 1,400 people slaughtered and murdered and 240 people kidnapped, that Israel is going to react. So it knew that it's going to be, that the civilians in Gaza are going to pay a price. Not because they are the aim of the attack, but because the Hamas is operating from within the civilians. But it uses them intentionally as human shields, and that because from the Hamas point of view, it's a win-win situation. Because there are two options. Either Israel refrains from attacking because civilians might get harmed on the other side, and then the Hamas retains its military capability, or the Hamas or Israel does attack, and then, of course, immediately all the pictures come out, the footage and the numbers of the civilians, and the numbers are many times also exaggerated. They also don't make any differentiation between civilians and between combatants of the Hamas that are killed, that are not civilians, and they are actually the target of the attack, lawful targets in themselves. So, of course, there's no differentiation. The numbers are many times inaccurate. We've seen also footage of bodies that are actually moving. So there's also a lot of fake. But anyway, there are also a lot of casualties. I am not saying that they aren't. But immediately these pictures, this footage immediately comes out to the international media, and the pressure starts on Israel. And this pressure leads Israel it makes it more difficult to Israel to carry out further attacks. So again, if it doesn't do that, again, the military infrastructure of the Hamas is saved. So whatever they do, so again, it's a win-win. Either we don't attack and they retain their military capabilities, or we do attack, there's a lot of pressure on Israel to stop. So eventually, again, they will retain the military capabilities. And the fact that the world does, that this works, that there is so much pressure on Israel, makes it a very attractive way to continue. So it's actually endangering more civilians because it makes it a good measure to use in this war against Israel. And just the last point about the humanitarian access, and then I'll open to questions. I started by explaining that Israel did not have effective control on the Gaza Strip since 2005. And didn't even have control on all the external perimeter because there's an open border with Egypt, which means that this is not occupied territory. The definition, the legal determination whether a territory is occupied is effective control. So if a state has effective control, it can be considered occupier. Israel did not have effective control over Gaza Strip since 2007 to 2005. And as we can see, this attack that the Hamas managed to do and surprise us is proof that we did not have effective control, which means that we don't have obligations to provide the civilians in Gaza with their needs. They're not our responsibility. The only responsibility that we have, Israel did provide some of the water, some of the electricity. By the way, only 10% of the water was provided by Israel. 50% of the electricity was provided, but this was not out of a legal obligation necessarily. It was because there were links between the countries. By the way, in the first day, on the 7th of October, the Hamas attack, between other things, it also hit all 9, I think, out of the 10 electricity lines that were entering from Israel to the Gaza Strip. So there's also this point that is interesting to note, that they were the ones that also hit, and also all the entry and exit points between the Gaza Strip and Israel were attacked by the Hamas. Anyway, Israel doesn't have a legal obligation to supply anything. What it does have is an obligation towards the enemy civilians, the civilians of the enemy, is to prevent starvation you're allowed to starve enemy forces, but you're not allowed to starve the enemy's civilians, and to allow the entry of humanitarian aid necessary for the survival of the population, which is a very limited list of what you are supposed to allow the transfer, not to supply yourself, but allow the transfer to the enemy civilians. And you can also put conditions, and the conditions can include also to see to it that it doesn't get into the hands of the enemy forces. In fact, Israel is at the moment allowing more than what the law obligates it to do, because from the Israeli perspective, a humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip is against our interest. We don't want the Palestinians there to suffer more than, we don't want them to suffer, and it also again puts pressure on Israel, so it's also against our interests. So food and water, we are supplying water, we are allowing food and water also to enter through Egypt, the Egyptian border, medicines, medical stuff, all the things are entered. They're being inspected to see that they don't hide weapons and other military, other supplies necessary for military operations. But in general, the idea is to try to prevent as much as possible any kind of humanitarian crisis. So I will stop here and open maybe for questions.
Thank you, Pnina. I'll just take advantage of my position here for a second, just to ask you a question, which is, have there been, to your knowledge, similar military campaigns waged in the modern era, that sort of since the Second World War, I suppose, in densely urban centres where the sorts of considerations that you've been talking about have needed to be taken into consideration, and how have the militaries that have waged those wars, how have they fared generally?
Well, there have been. There were, of course, the conflicts against Al-Qaeda and then against ISIS that were also fought part of the time in densely populated areas, especially with ISIS. You had, of course, Mosul and other areas. And the coalition forces operated there, and they had similar challenges, and they also had quite a lot of civilian casualties. I think the Hamas in general learned a lot and is copying ISIS. We also found flags of ISIS and booklets of Al-Qaeda on the bodies of some of the terrorists. And one of the things that they do, and I think ISIS also did it, was booby trap houses. So they keep the civilians in, and they also booby trap the houses. And also here we have the tunnels. So sometimes even if you attack in one place, and then house will explode in another place. So the idea of using the civilians and the civilian suffering is something that is a tactic that has been used with those other terrorist organizations. I think the difference here is that the US and the other coalition forces fighting against ISIS were fighting against a very, very vicious terror organization that was threatening the world in general, but it wasn't a direct threat that we are facing. I mean, I don't remember of any Western country. I mean, we have, of course, Ukraine and Russia, but apart from that, a Western country that has been under an existential threat from all parties by those that are aiming at destroying it and have the ability maybe to even do it, or at least to destroy parts of it. That didn't happen since the Second World War. So we on the one hand have all the difficulties of fighting in this densely urban area against an enemy that is using civilians as shields, and at the same time we are facing a very, very significant threat that is very to our I don't know if it's our existence, it might even be our existence, but to our really the ability to live in parts of the country, our ability to sustain an economy, the economy. I mean, we have so many people now in reserve duty, businesses are closing. So this is really shaking up the country from its core. So this is unique. So and again, in these cases also, and these forces were also accused afterwards of using excessive force, of too many civilian casualties. But I think when you speak to people that were there and to legal advisors of the militaries, we share similar dilemmas, and the criticism usually comes from outside, from international organizations that have political agendas, or from human rights bodies that have a very, I think, detached idea of the reality of armed conflict situations, and academia, again, that have many times a detachment and misunderstanding of how it looks on the ground and what are the real challenges, and think that you can fight a war and still get your military, still defend yourself and avoid any civilian casualties. This kind of utopian kind of idea, and then judge militaries by these unrealistic standards.
Okay. So I've got a couple of, I'm going to merge some questions that I have here. One of them asks the question, do the laws of war apply to combatants who violate it? In other words, if you hold civilian hostages in the area of combat, do the laws of war apply? And I mean, my guess to that question is, with respect to civilians, it will apply, because it's not their fault that there are civilians being held in their vicinity. But then I'll mix it in with another question, which is, where there are combatants who are violating international law by having their arm stashes and attacking from civilian targets, are they then responsible for the actions of armies who then hit civilians?
So, of course, the Hamas, on top of all the war crimes that it's carrying out against us, is also carrying war crimes against the Palestinian people, because using them as shields is a war crime also, and you have an obligation to avoid and to take precautions, passive precautions towards your own peoples that they're of course not fulfilling. There was even by the way, it was a very interesting interview of one of the Hamas leaders in the Russian TV. And the interviewer asked him, why don't you let the civilians go into the tunnels when Israel is bombing? And they said, no, the tunnels are for our military operations, and 75% of the Palestinians in Gaza are refugees, so they are the responsibility of UNRWA, the UN agency. And this is, you can find it on the web. It's a known figure of the Hamas telling this on TV now. So of course they're responsible, but doesn't relieve Israel of its responsibility to still try to minimize harm to civilians. Again, the laws of armed conflict are not about gentlemen, fighting each other, and if the one breaks the law, the other can also break the law. It's about protecting the civilians, the innocent civilians, the uninvolved civilians. So you still have the obligation to try to minimize harm to civilians. You still have to take them into account in the proportionality analysis, and of course, it is the Hamas that is using them, and the responsibility should also be laid on the Hamas, or even mainly laid on the Hamas. But as we know, when it comes to the legitimacy, when it comes to the international campaigns against Israel that are very, very organized, and a lot of bias, so all the pressure is put, all the criticism is on the side of Israel. You don't even hear it mentions that the Hamas has any responsibility, or in general criticizing the Hamas for its tactic that is actually killing civilians.
Okay, thank you. Another question that's been asked here is, do you think that Israeli interpretation of international human rights law has changed in the last 2 decades, and specifically in this recent war? And how do you respond to those saying that Israel allows itself to do today much more than it did in the past?
Well, first of all, we're talking about laws of armed conflict or international humanitarian law, not about human rights law. Again, the law is the law, and the interpretation is the same interpretation. But the law applies as in actually in any field, but it's also true, of course, to the laws of armed conflict. Applies to the circumstances. It depends on the circumstances. So when you're fighting an enemy that has a weapon, if you have two enemies that have the same weapon, the one is much more dangerous, is threatening you directly, you know that they can use this weapon in a way that it could use it against a very important affect you very badly, and the other one has the same weapon but is not threatening so much and does not have the capabilities, can't use this weapon. So it's the same weapon, but the military advantage is not the same military advantage if you take away this weapon or you take away this weapon, and the proportionality, since it's related to the realities of the conflict. So of course that could change, and that's why in previous rounds Israel could maybe be more even in situations where it could attack. And it would even be considered proportionate, but it could have the benefit of avoiding, because the threat was still, there was a threat, but it wasn't so big. At one stage, the Obama administration decided on a zero civilian casualty policy against ISIS. This is not what the law requires, but you can decide as an issue of policy. You can always limit yourself beyond the law. At the moment, I think we don't have. We cannot afford to place on themselves too many limitations beyond what the law requires. And I think the law that is applied is the same principles that are applied. The principles take into account the realities of the conflict that we are fighting. Otherwise, I think it would be a misapplication of the laws. You wouldn't expect us to use a lot of force if the threat was very weak. They would say that's excessive, that's too much. So why, when the threat is very big, it doesn't impact the element, how much force we can use. So it's yes, I think it is relevant, the level of threat, and I think it is enters into the way that the military advantage is examined. I can also say that if you look at the laws of armed conflict, the laws of war manual of the Department of Defense, of the US Department of Defense, it says that the military advantage is you look at the military advantage anticipated, and I'm reading, from an attack when considered as a whole, and not only from its isolated or particular parts. And it says that military advantage is not restricted to immediate tactical gains, but may be assessed in the full context of the war strategy. Which means that you can look at the bigger picture of what is the threat and how the components of the targets of the military capabilities of the enemy, of eliminating them, how does that impact the war strategy?
Are there courts that have set precedents for this, or are most of the principles that you're talking about based on the military manuals of Western armies? I mean, just as for instance, one of the questions here asks, what, and it's also based on what you were just saying, is there how do we know whether something is proportionate in terms of civilian damage versus military advantage? I mean, it's sort of apples and pears. So do we have a judicial precedent, if we're talking as lawyers, or is it really just based on military manuals and military practice?
It's based on practice. It's based on on practice, on deliberations between experts. But eventually, you have to apply the law to the given certain circumstances. There's no formula. And yes, it's a very, very difficult assessment, and you're right, it's two different things that you are weighing. And also there's a lot of uncertainty. You don't always know. You don't always know what will be the military advantage, the exact military advantage. You're not always completely sure what is in the target. I mean, and you also don't know what will be the civilian casualties, especially I'm talking because of this booby trap. So you don't even know, you might be attacking a certain building that you have actually established that it is empty, and suddenly the building next door or two buildings nearby will explode because they are linked in the tunnel with explosives. So that of course you cannot anticipate. So So it's very difficult also even just to get to know what to anticipate, and then also to carry out this balancing, which is also, there's again no formula. So yes, it's a lot of there's a lot of uncertainty in this process. But again, that's the reality. It's not that you have the you don't have the luxury of saying, oh, this is a difficult decision, I'll just not decide.
One of the questions here is, can you talk about the technical operation of the legal department? How are the mechanics between the commanders and the lawyers? You know, do commanders come to lawyers with a specific target in mind and discuss it? How does it work in practice between the decision-making process in deciding whether to hit a particular target?
But first of all, I've not been in I retired in 2009, and things maybe have changed. But in general, the idea is, first of all, before an operation in regular times, legal advisors are involved first of all, in preparing military plans that are afterwards the basis of the military commands, and also when there is a military command, in seeing that the legal aspects are intertwined into the command. It's not a legal annex in the end that nobody will read. The operational plan or the operational command itself already has the law inside it. It's already, and also you have sometimes all kinds of questions about legality of measures and means of different tactics, and what we call a target bank, pre-planned targets. So they are also discussed, and there are legal advisors that are consulting on their legality, especially when it's the issues that are more complex legally. But when you have the ongoing operations, so what happens is that we shift to a 24/7 approach, where you have shifts and we have legal advisors there all the time. And they are sitting actually that's why it's from the division level up, because division level up, you have avodat mateh, we call it in Hebrew. So you have like a process of decisions. Yes, how did you say?
The work of the general staff.
Yes, but it's not of the general staff, it's of the staff of the commander. And then you have so you have these deliberations in real time, and you have the intelligence is there, and the technical expert, and all kinds of experts, and the civilian aspect, humanitarian, and the spokesperson sometimes, if it's and the legal advisor. So they're all there, and the legal advisor will be involved in the decision. The legal advisor can say in certain circumstances, you cannot do this, it's not lawful, and then the commander will not do it. Many times it's not black and white, so it's more a deliberation, and the legal advisor would raise concerns and say maybe this is something that has to be taken into account. So it's really a process of deliberations together and making the correct decision. In the rare cases, and they do happen, where the legal advisor says, no, you can't do it. I don't know how rare they are, they happen. It's rare because the commanders already know. So usually they wouldn't raise something that is, but if it does happen, so the option is to go up to the commander of the legal advisor and the commander of the commander, and it can go up to the level of the prime minister even, and the attorney general, but it would stop maybe in the level of the general chief of staff and the military advocate general. Those are exactly in the cases where they don't accept the fact that the legal advisor says this is not legal.
Okay. I think probably the last question before we have to end, is obviously at the end of this, there are going to be claims brought against Israel, and there are going to be claims brought against individual commanders and soldiers and generals. And the question is, which courts have jurisdiction over Israel, and how will Israel fight its defense?
Well, first of all, Israeli courts have jurisdiction. So, of course, if there are cases, war crimes, so they will be investigated internally. We've had already some cases being investigated, and soldiers on mistreatment or ill treatment of detainees, of Palestinian detainees. So we deal with that internally, of course. But we also have, there is the potential of international investigations from two kinds. The one is the International Criminal Court, because the ICC, because there is an open investigation already there on the war crimes carried out, or crimes that are under the authority of the court that have been carried out since the 13th of June 2014 until, and it's an open-ended, in the Palestinian occupied territory, so it's the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the East Jerusalem. This is an investigation that Israel opposes and has claimed that the court has no jurisdiction because Israel is not a member of the ICC and the Palestine is not a country, it's not a state, but this position was rejected. So we do have an open investigation, so we might face investigations there. I doubt, I must say, again, the prosecutor today seems a very professional person. The judges, not so much. I mean, we've had some bad experience with judges making weird decisions in the past, like a pretrial chamber that was insisting that the flotilla case, and not only to enter into all the things, but a case where the previous prosecutor thought that there's no place to open an investigation because 10 people that were killed in clashes with soldiers that were in internal clashes where they were threatening them is not a grave enough crime to be investigated by the court, and the pretrial chamber, with a majority of 2 judges, was insisting that it is. So the judges I don't know about, but the prosecutor seems a professional person. It's very, very difficult to make a case of disproportionate use of force. There's also a question if it's an international armed conflict or non-international armed conflict, because if it's a non-international armed conflict, then you don't even have the crime of using of a disproportionate force. And we are fighting a non-state actor, so that's one issue. But even if they say, oh, it is an international armed conflict, and there haven't been any prosecutions until today, including in the courts of that they prosecuted the Yugoslavia, the ICTY, the crimes in the war of the Yugoslavia, or Rwanda. They prosecuted anybody or found anybody, charged anybody on the issue of disproportionate, and because it's so difficult to prove. And again, I think Israel is acting proportionally. So I believe that a professional prosecutor won't go and carry out an investigation on that. We are clearly not attacking civilians directly, so that one also I don't fear. Again, as long as they are acting professionally. And there's another option, is these proceedings around the world, what is called the universal jurisdiction, or sometimes it's passive jurisdiction. And again, sometimes there are attempts to bring prosecutions there against Israeli commanders or against Israeli senior officials. Again, I think there probably would be such attempts. I think eventually it really depends on also where the world will be and what will be the position towards Israel. We are not always treated fairly. So we'll see what will happen in the end of this war. I think if we are treated fairly, so I don't think these prosecutions would go ahead.
Pnina, thank you very, very much for your time this evening. One of the questions that I also was asked was, who am I? So I'll just say I'm Adrian Daniels, a partner at the firm of Arnon Tadmor Levy. And I actually worked many years ago with Pnina in the international law department, although I think my only action of any note while I was there was collapsing on my first day with a burst appendix. So
you came in with a bang.
Yes, exactly. I certainly came in with a bang. That's, I suspect, all I'm remembered for there. But yeah, we did work together many years ago. Anyway, thank you very, very much, Pnina, for your time this evening. I hope that this has been helpful for those who wanted to understand a little bit more about the words, the terms, the terminology that we're hearing in the news. personally, I just find it very difficult that any international campaign can be covered in such a saturated manner that casualties are counted one by one on every side, and somehow that should give an impression of the morality of one side against the other. I think if that were the case, then clearly the Second World War wouldn't have been won by the right side. Unfortunately, I think we don't look at wars in the right way anymore. We don't remember how awful wars are, and clearly the laws of war were never supposed to be designed in a manner that prevented the side that actually tried to comply with them from defeating the side that didn't. But in many ways, that's the approach that many people seem to take these days. I'm hoping that Pnina's talk this evening gave us some food for thought there to try and understand, how things work in the real world. So it's 2 minutes to 7. I think we've pretty much done this to the minute. So thank you all very, very much, and hoping that we'll only hear good news from now on in, and a quiet time as soon as possible for all of us, wherever you may be. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you.